Very warm welcome to today's session of Vertigo of Reality Preparation Office. The entire adventure will be held in English. I take the chance to also welcome the people that we have on live stream. We received a lot of messages and requests caused by our very special guest Liam Young today. That people will follow on the live stream that we offer every Wednesday, every session. Vertigo of Reality has a digital space thanks to our team that is recording and live streaming. My name is Julia Albani. I work with Johannes Odenthal on the program of Vertigo of Reality, and we, in the whole program of 1 year meeting every Wednesday, we had several blind dates. And today, 5th of March, was one of them, and we wanted to address questions of vertigo related to space. And today we have Liam Young from London, and later on another guest, Eric Ellingsen from the Institut für Raumexperimente. He will join us after Liam Young's performance. In the second part of the event, it will be a rather informal conversation between the two of them under my moderation. Liam Young, you find kind of information about his profile, which is a rather one of its kind. So I will keep it short and try to bring Liam to stage for his performance as soon as possible. But I would like to give you a few remarks. His two platforms, or his two main platforms, about the many other that he's active on, Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, realize an enormous amount of different projects. I had the chance to work with him a year ago for the Lisbon Architecture Triennale, where he curated the exhibition Future Perfect. The other platform that he founded, Unknown Fields Division, is currently preparing an expedition to the South Seas in China, which are having an open application running. So who catches fire tonight and wants to be part of the Vertigo of Reality created by Liam Young can subscribe and be part of the trip that you will hear about a little bit later in his performance. So I give the word to Liam, and thanks so much for coming over from London today, and great to have you here in the preparation office.
Thanks, Julia. Thanks for the invite. It's great to be back in Berlin. Hi, everyone. I'm going to start with a bit of an intro. I'm aware that most of the people in the audience may not know who the hell I am, and it's kind of useful to unpack it a little bit just to contextualize some of the stuff that I wanted to talk about tonight. Like, I'm trained as an architect, but primarily I'm interested in the question of what technology is doing at a global or urban scale. I'm really interested in the concept of what is city, what is architecture in a digital world, a world where technology is the dominant force shaping the planet. So very often it means that the work that we do sits outside of the traditional domain of what one might think of as architecture. But I do think the work is spatial, and I do think the work is very much connected with the reality of the way that the world is working, which I guess is part of the impetus behind the invitation tonight. So really what I want to do is talk about this idea of city, or the idea of place, and not to think about city or place as a single point in reality, in space, at a particular point on the planet, but to talk about the city as a kind of a networked object. The city casts shadows that stretch far and wide, and I want to kind of take us on a walking tour tonight to explore those shadows, to explore the sorts of landscapes, networks that are fundamental in creating our experience of the real city today. But first, a kind of a prologue, as I said, just to introduce what it is that we do. So I run a think tank called Tomorrow's Thoughts Today, and we're interested in exploring fantastic and perverse visions of the future, not so much for the accuracy of their predictions, but really for the critical engagement that they offer with the changing spaces of the everyday. So we borrow from tools of speculative scenarios, we deploy narrative, the illustrations of fictions, as imaginative tools to explore the implications and consequences of emerging technologies and environmental conditions. So it's really the idea of an architectural practice as think tank, I suppose. A practice not built on buildings as endpoints, but on speculation and research as a product in itself. A useful kind of introduction might be this project, which Julia started to mention. This is a movie miniature model for a work called Future Perfect, which was our exhibition at the Lisbon Architecture Triennale. And it was developed around a think tank I organized with a collection of science fiction authors, speculative gamers, mavericks, visionaries, luminaries, people like Bruce Sterling, Warren Ellis, the scientist Rachel Armstrong, Microsoft Research, Building Blog, New Scientist, and so on. And we came together to debate the social, cultural, and environmental consequences of emerging research. It was really kind of a brainstorm session to think about what the future city could be. So then we started to take that material from this kind of public discourse and work with film and game designers, concept artists from those worlds, and we gave that city a material form through these kind of artworks. I gave it a geography, a physicality, an image that was distill some of these ideas and technologies that we were talking about into a form that an audience might find familiar or could start to connect with. We worked with special effects artists from films such as kind of Alien, Sunshine, Blade Runner, and we built this room-sized movie miniature model of this imaginary city. And across the course of the exhibition, a series of authors were invited to inhabit the scale movie set and develop a collection of characters, narratives, films, and illustrations. We developed this kind of millimeter-precise laser scan of the city, which is being used for projection mapping and animation. We developed 5 districts or environments of the city, 5 suburbs, and worked with collaborations between an artist, designer, and a tech company to give life to the landscape of the city and create it as a inhabitable landscape that an audience could start to move through. And really what we're interested in was the idea that fiction is this extraordinary shared language. You know, we all spend a Friday nights watching a shitty popcorn movie or falling asleep reading a novel, and it's really the way that our culture shares ideas. So the idea was to co-opt tools from fiction and to bring them into the space of technology and actually start to present emerging ideas about the future city in a way that, through fictions, in a way that the audience could connect with. Like this film, which is set in our fictional city that we shot on location in India. So India became this stage set for our anticipated future. It's a kind of a version of the future in the present tense. So we're interested in this idea that, you know, the futures we're presenting aren't pure fantasy, but rather they're exaggerations of present conditions. They're extrapolations of existing conditions. And that is really kind of what I want to do and talk about tonight. I want to take us on a walking tour through the landscapes of the present and extrapolate and imagine and exaggerate possible futures that may start to come out of it. Which is really part of the practice that I do. The other half of me is, as Julia mentioned, is unknown fields. And what the mandate of Unknown Fields is we're a nomadic design research studio, so we travel and explore unknown territories to think about a changing relationship between technology and the city. So far from a city, the metropolis, or a city like Berlin, lie the dislocated hinterlands that support the mechanizations of these modern cities. So a city like this one is thoroughly embedded in a global network of landscapes and infrastructures that are too often ignored, forgotten, or unseen. So we go on 2 expeditions a year, a winter expedition, a summer expedition, to explore the ends of the earth, and we follow global supply chains to visit forgotten landscapes, alien terrains and obsolete ecologies. So across the last few years, we've taken expeditions through the Ecuadorian Amazon and the Galapagos Islands, the irradiated wilderness of Chernobyl, the Guatemala and Belize. We were there for 2012 and the end of the world, according to the Mayan long calendar. The mining landscapes of outback Western Australia, the Arctic ice shelf and the climate change landscapes of far north Alaska. 2 years ago we bought an old school bus from eBay and we went on a road trip through the UFO conspiracy spaceports and the militarized landscapes of the US, finishing at the Burning Man Festival, collecting stories of militarized landscapes and exploring the relationship between landscape and technology. So what we talk about is that the work of Unknown Field is about going out into the world looking for weak signals of possible futures. They're kind of futures in the present tense. We go to far north Alaska because in a place like London, where I'm based, climate change is still a fiction. It's still a future. You go to far north Alaska, and you spend time with native whaling communities, and their lifestyles are fundamentally changing. The whale migration patterns have shifted. The edge of the melting ice has changed, and their lives are utterly changed. They become these strange pockets of possible futures scattered around the world. So in many ways, these landscapes are they're places that are dealing with the immediacy of emerging trends that we can see playing out in a much more visceral way than you see in our more familiar cities. So you kind of map the complex and contradictory realities of the present as a site of strange and extraordinary futures. So last summer's expedition, we just got back in last winter's expedition, sorry, we just got back in January from our trip through the South China Seas. And this is we're doing another version of this expedition in the summer, where we travel on board. We were just on board. This is the CMA CGM Blue Whale that we picked up in Hong Kong. We traveled down the China coast, and we're exploring the idea of following a supply chain. Shipping industry is an extraordinary industry that touches every aspect of our lives, yet somehow sits and bubbles below the surface. What we were doing is using the cargo ship as a vessel through which to travel and connect up a whole series of manufacturing landscapes in China to explore the world behind this laptop or the phone in my pocket, to kind of trace the realities that exist behind the luminous screens and glistening rectangles of our familiar cities. We encountered this village in China. This is Guiyu, which is the point at which your phone becomes obsolete. It ends up here in this site. It made 60 Minutes a couple of years ago because the streets were lined with keyboards and computer frames, and they've since cleaned up the village. Or that's what really happened is that the government didn't like the publicness of Guiyu and its recycling industry, so it moves into people's interiors. This is the interior of someone's house, and in the back is their kitchen, and people are essentially remining our obsolete technologies for rare earth magnets and precious metals that are still present in very small quantities on our circuit boards. This is the gentleman in the house, his daughter, who's playing amongst the e-waste. So these are kind of the consequences that we don't typically think about when we start to talk about the city and the technologies it contains. And our project is really to head out and cover these landscapes and start to reposition them within counter-narratives. So really these are the two aspects of our work. So in TTT and on the Unknown Fields Division, what we kind of do is explore alternative worlds or alternative realities in the context of tonight's session as a means to understand our own world, our own reality in new ways. So with Unknown Fields, we go on expeditions to strange places to gather and collect trends and weak signals that are shaping the world. And then with TTT, we exaggerate and extrapolate those trends and explore them as a series of speculative scenarios. So we talk about it as it's not a kind of data visualization, but it's sort of data dramatization, where we use fiction and counter-narratives to position us in new relationships with these kind of landscapes. It's a form of system storytelling, I suppose. Stories like this place. So this is a pop-up city that happens from zero in China, where we just were, and this is its shadow. So it's the idea of kind of twin cities or parallel cities. The Mount Newman iron ore mine on the right, where ore from this hole was mined, transported in trains, that stretched for kilometres, loaded onto a freighter and then sent to China to be smelted into steel to make the city on the left. So we're really interested in this idea that you remap or reimagine the city, or the realities of the city, and the technologies it contains, not as a discrete, independent collection of buildings and objects, but as a networked condition, a condition generated by a wide array of local and global landscapes. As I mentioned, the city as a place casts shadows that stretch far and wide. So what I want to start to do tonight is explore this idea that by narrating these systems, visualizing them, telling stories about them, creating new fictions within them, we can start to generate a new idea of site, a new idea of place, and begin to engage with this complexity in alternative ways. So what I want to do is kind of take us all tonight on a sort of a wander through a new city, a brave new now, as I call it, a city that's somewhere between the real and the imagined, somewhere between the present and the future, a city that's stretched across the earth in holes in the ground, on circuit boards, in fiber optic cables, in objects, the cities, the shadow cities that we all unwittingly inhabit every day of our lives. It'll be a kind of a whistle-stop walking tour through the wonders of nature, some real landscapes that we've visited with the Unknown Fields Division across the years, and some imagined as projects with TTT and within the Unknown Fields studio. It'll be a collage of fact and fiction, the irony being that very often we can't really tell which is which, and that speculative fiction is sometimes the best way of dealing with a reality that we very often struggle to grasp. It's good. Could we actually drop those lights before we start our walk? Is that possible? Whoever has the switch. Thanks. So let's begin our wander through the city. Looking around, I see a place I know, but at the same time find strangely unfamiliar. She asked me where we are. We walk on, and we come to the edge of a new territory. We look out across an evolving fragment in endless construction. Here, the traditional infrastructure of roads, buildings, and public squares are giving way to ephemeral global supply chains, logistics infrastructure, digital networks, biotechnologies, and cloud computing connections. The physical city we know is dissolving. She asks, is our city still a city anymore? And so as the economy collapses, as the climate shifts, and the city is reshaped by emerging technologies. The city, the future, is beginning to become a project again. We have come to the city at the beginning of its life. It is a brave new now. She whispers while we listen to the whistle of computer cooling and the bleeps of mirrored beasts living out their luminous lives. We started its edges, the mysterious interior of desert plains and mining landscapes. In the distance, we see the lights of the city that these landscapes help create. The history of these remote landscapes is one of nuclear testing, rocket launches, and black military technologies. The skies over this red earth are scarred with the contrails of experimental weapons flights and charged with the militarized electromagnetic waves that reach out to US troops in Afghanistan and Iraq. And forgotten somewhere in this landscape, we stumble upon an abandoned missile tracking station. And from here, a choreographed flock of autonomous gliders drifts through the air in silent protest. They float on engineered thermal currents. Their wingspan antennas broadcast white noise through the electromagnetic landscapes over the nearby military base that coordinates drone strikes half a world away.
Cap 6-7, that's all day.
In the Australian landscape is Pine Gap Military Base, a base that is actually US territory, and it's from there, because of its position on the planet, that they orchestrate communications between their troops in different distant landscapes. Can we put the sound up? Can we put the sound up? We can't put the sound up. Can we put the sound up? Oh, yeah. So as the drones drift across the Pine Gap military base, they momentarily jam the telecommunications signals and the infrastructure of static and disturbance. Forgive me while I try and turn the volume up on this thing as well. So below these contested skies, we also tread equally contested ground. So these are the dislocated resource sites that support the brave new now. They are new landscapes that exist on the periphery, but are strangely dependent on the technology of our more familiar metropolises. So here we stare out across the gold mine, a site whose gold is embedded in all the pieces of technology we are carrying around with us. We each have a little piece of this ground on us now. It has been exploded into an endless constellation of artifacts. Just like this familiar specimen, a cute but strangely annoying creature that lives in all of our pockets. This is how we typically understand this little guy, 16 gigabytes of memory, or this, 4,000 songs. But its real effects are this, 0.034 grams of gold, and in turn this. And these holes are cut out of this landscape. This are the paintings of Aboriginal Dreamtime. These paintings catalogue the creation stories of the dreamtime and narratives that speak of a time when the ground was soft and creation beings slinked and shaped rivers and mountains, the rainbow serpent, or a wild dog coming to rest and forming a mountain. So stories are sung of these creatures as paths are walked through the landscape. And these song lines are now cut with the white scars of modern mining. Scars that are themselves shaped by modern fictions, that are the virtual values of fluctuating gold prices. So these are the real-time models of the gold mine, and they're connected live to the gold price index. So here we see in green the gold ore, and around it in white the continually changing shape of the mine. So what happens is that as the gold price rises, it becomes more cost-effective to mine areas of lower concentration of gold. And as the gold price drops, then you only mine areas of high concentration. So what's happening, etched into the ground at the scale of the Grand Canyon, is a kind of data geology, a sort of a geologic data visualization of the fluctuating price of gold as these models are linked live to that variable price index. And here is the mythical beast of the Anthropocene. These creatures have replaced the slow erosion of mountains and rivers through water and wind, and they start to shape these landscapes. And here is its home, 1 mile below ground, where it crushes and explodes the gold ore, manipulated by remote control operators, dumped into a truck the size of a city, ground up, processed in tanks of cyanide, rinsed and settled, processed through a bioengineered gold-eating bacterial soup before being filtered off and piped to the gold room, which is a high-security room where only one man in the mine has access to. So here in the brave new now, we encounter a modern alchemist. We shake his hand. He's a hero amongst the gold miners. He is Pete the gold pourer. And this is Pete. And here Pete pours the gold and weighs it, 19.8 kilograms, that we hold in our hands. It's the result of 200 dump trucks the size of buildings. It's dug out of the ground, quantified, and then scattered around the world and put back into the ground in a handful of vaults where it stays to be traded virtually. The fictions of commodity prices and the infrastructures of gold's solely virtual value in the algorithmic world has extraordinary physical implications. So perhaps the brave new now could be filled with a new infrastructure of gold objects, a glittering architecture exploded across the globe as a network of artifacts, where the infrastructure of gold's virtual value is reimagined through a dispersed geology of artifacts which could be inscribed with old histories, personal stories, and things of a sentimental value. It's like the Voyager gold record. The gold bar could be redesigned as spools of lost and endangered languages from indigenous sites where the resources extracted gets encoded onto a reimagined gold bar, and the gold vault becomes an archive of cultural information. And the gold-plated headphone jack that has embodied within it an indigenous songline from the place the gold was extracted from. So just like the secret tracks of a Beatles record hidden within the tunes of the latest shitty pop song are the endangered oral histories from the mine site where the resource was extracted. And the sound of grandmother's laughter is encoded into an heirloom necklace. Or Mary Anderson, who works at a diner in Rhode Island. She likes to read Hello and Vogue magazine, and she dreams of having a better life. She says, if I am beautiful, she thinks to herself, I can get out of here. So night by night, she sweeps the floors and cleans the grime from the ovens, collecting the pennies that she's been saving to make herself beautiful. And as her hands become rough, she works towards implants, gold implants, that will remove the tired eyes in her tired lines in her eyes. And the implant has encoded within it her ideal DNA. She thinks, when I am gone, they'll be able to read who I really am inside. And this was the suicide bullet of Hunter S. Thompson, where inscribed along its contours is a note to his wife Anita, which he entitled, Football Season is Over. No more games, no more bombs, no more walking, no more fun, no more swimming. 67, that's 17 years past 50. 17 more than I wanted or needed. Boring, I'm always bitchy. No fun for anybody. 67, you are getting greedy. Act your age. Relax, this won't hurt. So from the deserts and gold mines, we head for the coast. We navigate an offshore archipelago, an iconic wilderness, like the Galapagos Islands, a collection of rare ecologies. We are guided ashore by the US Navy. A team of strobe-like wielding dolphins and sea lions protect the coastline against enemy swimmers. When they find an intruder, they drop a strobe light and it illuminates the surface, marking the spot and drawing human security guards from nearby to handle the rest. We pass the island of Levi's. We're not in Texas anymore. A new city composed of all the places across the planet that are touched by the Levi's 501 supply chain. A city the size of a planet that we find embedded in our pants. A pair of jeans travels 18,744 kilometers around the planet in its process of manufacture. If we were to collapse all of those places down into a single factory, it would just be 2 kilometers long. We pass the island of BMW. 14 nations collapsed into a car. We pass the island of Boeing 787. On this island is the largest interior volume in human history, the Boeing Everett Assembly Plant. Here we have conceived of an object so complex, so intricate, that it requires the collective effort of the entire planet to build. It's a world project, stitching together landscapes, people, and artifacts from across the globe and assembled in the biggest building in human history. We pass Nike Town, a population of 1.26 million workers, a little smaller than Madrid, and a little smaller than Madrid, and a little smaller than Manhattan, and a little bigger than Madrid. So we pass through these islands now to a new wilderness, a city of our faded dreams, where we once imagined an atomic utopia, an energy city, another kind of factory town, where under the shadows of nuclear disaster, from a rooftop of an overgrown apartment block in Pripyat, Ukraine, we survey the irradiated wilderness of Chernobyl and bear witness to a sobering post-apocalyptic vision. This is the site of our faded dreams of technology's dominance over nature, a site where we once explored the very fundamental edges of physics. It was once called the City of Tomorrow. It is now a post-industrial landscape, a new wilderness, somewhere between promise and despair, a kind of a city gone feral. So here we meet the free settlers that were illegally moved back in. Against the Ukrainian government warnings, they have moved back home, living off the land, raising chickens and picking blueberries. He holds up a postcard we give him. It reads, "I'll be home soon." And here we encounter the new infrastructures of remote surveillance. We built these creatures to venture into areas of post-human landscapes that are too hazardous for us to explore. Fashioned after the early robots which they used to clean up the radiation site, they're actually repurposed experimental lunar rovers originally. We've created our own new robots, where their circuit boards elicit strange and unexpected behaviors when they encounter high levels of radiation. We see these landscapes remotely through the eyes of these nervous machines, and they create a new landscape of their own. And at the 30-kilometer security checkpoint, we meet our guide in this tour, a security guard here, and he tells us stories of his nights in the zone. Some years previously, a research team from GCSC Games World, a Ukrainian gaming company, surveyed this landscape. And they produced the game Stalker, based on the meticulous photorealistic rendering of this landscape. So local children now from the surrounding towns, avid fanboys of the game, now break into the zone at night to reenact their characters and favourite scenes from the game. So playing out their own virtual roles, our guide into this landscape enjoys chasing them at night through the crumbling buildings, through a simulated city overlaid across a physical one. These are parallel cities, deep cities that exist simultaneously in the real and the digital. The city is both here and here, distributed across the planet in flickering constellations of luminous rectangles. I now tell her about what's above. Drifting above us at 6,711 miles an hour is an intricate and improbable creation. Delicately dancing with gravity is a system of satellites. They are another kind of city, a GPS city, existing simultaneously overlaid across our own. In our city, ghost landscapes and spaces are designed perhaps to be visible purely in the GPS dataset. As we move through the Arctic region of the brave new now, we start to see that this spinning orbital network has started to displace traditional native ways of reading landscape. We can start to imagine a landscape illiterate community who now navigate through this territory purely through the lens of technology. And then we start to imagine that could we perhaps jam the GPS networks and reveal an alternative virtual topography, a territorial architecture of spoofed cartographies. So we start to imagine GPS ghost process icebergs that drift through the shipping lanes, disrupting the autonomously navigating oil tankers that purely find their way through GPS. Or could we imagine an oil company that hides its activity behind the clouds of spoofed GPS mountains? She looks down at our live visualization that translates the distortions and disturbances of the GPS navigational network into a new landscape, an ever-shifting digital territory.
Would you like to check in at your current location? Sharing location on Facebook, Twitter, Foursquare, Google+, and MySpace. Digital cartographic landmark detected.
Speed guidelines vary depending on GPS conditions.
That's amazing. Check out natural
Report
radio.
iceberg status.
These digital icebergs were launched yesterday, Wednesday, January 4th, and will reach the Chukchi oil fields in 3 days, 14 hours and 27 minutes. Navigational disruption expected with 11 of 17 oil tankers in the autonomously navigated shipping lanes.
You've got to be careful up here, even when the landscape appears stable and can be spoofed. You can never trust it. Those are the digital mountains of the National Petroleum Reserve. They're operated by drilling companies hiding, protecting their oil fields from terrorist threats.
Have a time check on that.
The GPS landscape we can think of as a kind of prosthetic Earth, a new surface crust of waypoints and satellite sight lines. As we glance up from our screens, we walk on. I take her to another city, another Earth. In this autonomous, strange interior is the Earth simulator, built by the NEC for the Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency. It was the world's fastest supercomputer between 2002 to 2004. The Earth simulator is used to run global climate simulations for both the atmosphere and the oceans. It is another kind of simulated landscape. And here, under the ceiling tiles, lies the Kraken, another supercomputer. Or the IBM Blue Gene, developed to simulate biochemical processes, and the IBM Roadrunner. And this is the Jaguar, with a peak speed of 2.33 petaflops. Over 2,000 trillion calculations per second, the Jaguar is the world's fastest supercomputer for unclassified research. It's capable of simulating climate models of extraordinary, unprecedented resolution. And this global menagerie of supercomputers, which are calculating our nature, named after nature, inform policy and ecological strategy, and they're designed to compute the complexities and interconnected nature of our world. And this is the UK Met Office supercomputer, a data infrastructure the size of 2 football pitches, based in the UK, and it calculates weather models and predicts the implications and consequences of climate change. The climate change models of the Met Office, however, consume about the same energy as a small town, making the meteorology office the most polluting building in the whole of Europe. So the virtual climate simulation models actually start to become an input into their own calculations. So the infrastructures of prediction, modeling, mapping, and simulation solely start to become landscapes in themselves, their own kind of microclimates, their own air cycles, their own reflexive energy systems. And in this room in Alaska is a supercomputer we meet in the brave new now. His name is Pac-Man. It has banks of parallel processors performing trillions of operations per second. It calculates the future of our planet. Embedded within its circuits is a city of far north Alaska that's both programmed with inputs from climate sensors all around the world, but also with the ice diaries of local whaling hunting captains. We start to visit the Arctic Refuge now, a landscape that has been engineered and rebuilt to perhaps become the world's fastest supercomputer, a kind of hypertext landscape as a probability machine, where calculated predictions coexist with the unpredictable. This is a landscape in contest right now. Below it is an extraordinary repository of oil. But how much is that oil worth? How much is a caribou worth as we run those calculations against it? Is it worth the cost of extracting that unknown quantity of oil? Or is that lower than the cost of cleaning up the possibility of an oil spill? This landscape becomes caught between probabilities, between possible futures, and perhaps it becomes a model of itself, where supercomputers become a new oracle and they attempt to calculate the variables to inform policy and long-term energy strategy. So as these supercomputers model the complexity of nature, they increasingly become indistinguishable from the landscapes that they are modeling.
Good morning, and as you join us, the Frontier Surveying Company 8-bit computational algorithms puts AMWA reserves between 5 to 16 billion barrels. 10 mega-election polls in bloom as political parties run future policies, generating speculative land values in Region 8. Land futures fluctuate as we see models follow predictive outcome. As OPEC projects $100 a barrel, geographically dispersed pools of risk computation form for all major energy companies. 90 gig pool mining ExxonMobil credit risk information, acceptable risk for ExxonMobil at 7 billion barrels. Exxon, BP, and TransCanada run complex risk algorithms where flows of high to low-level threats to profit margins are introduced. Following TransCanada risk margin model, high-level threshold at logic gate 25B as unforeseen holdups are embedded into the algorithm. 1 terabyte runs infrastructural issues due to unfavorable climate for drilling. Models run for drill bit supply issues from Far East. 1 petabyte computational risk projections for TransCanada puts their accepted risk margins of AMWA reserve at 12 billion barrels. A speculated model of 40% drop in fertilizer production in Texas. Home Energy Corporation model a prolonged winter and 8% rise in home oil prices. From solvent deodorant decline to governmental imposed carbon tax. 9 petabytes of data steadily predicts the trajectory of land values of the ANWR. A late ripple in the market as it reacts to scenarios of unrest in the Middle East. Land and oil valuations dance in opposition as crude closes out a seasonal record of $200 a barrel, peaking at 5x.
So, landscape documentary, nature documentary, perhaps become strained versions of CNBC stock broadcasts. Cities and landscapes at the scale of the planet also become compressed now to the scale of control rooms. This is the SCADA city, which stands for Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition. It's a city brain, regulating our energy, our water, and managing our traffic. The complexities of urban culture, life and wonder, the things we think about as cities as being random and extraordinary and happening moment by moment, become reduced to management protocols and low-res systems diagrams. These are the interfaces that actually make our cities work. I tell her we must understand these machines as cities and landscapes also. Landscapes of technology and the technologies of landscape. We begin to understand the complex connections now that exist between our everyday lives in a wider global context. We are now getting closer to the center of the brave new now, the center of the city. She stumbles across the uneven ground. It's faceted and abstracted, a computed geology, part rock pool, part sedimentary construction site, glistening with moisture and bathed in the light from street lamp stars. A space where shopping trolleys scurry about in search of a home, where nature hums and crackles to the sound of flickering fluorescence, and behind the scenes of a SCADA city, it watches on, and the traffic lights flash red.
Some birds have refined their technique. They station themselves beside pedestrian crossings. Wait for the lights to stop the traffic. Then collect your cracked nut in safety.
So in Tokyo, a bird becomes dependent on a nut that its beak hasn't evolved to crack, and it employs the traffic system to do so.
A massive seal brings traffic to a halt in Brazil. The animal, which was estimated to weigh more than half a ton, took a leisurely stroll through the streets of Balneário Camboriú. The 10-foot sea creature waddled out of the Atlantic and headed up the beach before blocking traffic on the main street for more than an hour. Police officers and firefighters splashed water on the elephant seal, which politely used the crossing to keep it wet during its unexpected adventure, as shoppers and tourists snapped pictures and videos. Then it simply popped back into the water.
So the cities and the systems and mechanisms of these cities now regulate wildlife, and cities are becoming contemporary jungles and new geologies. These modern landscapes are now watched over by scientists as hotbeds of evolutionary change and new animal life. As animals have found their way back into our cities, a number of them have grown dependent on the technologically mediated landscapes that we provide them. And technology is now a key driver in evolutionary change. And here we watch as the raccoons in San Francisco have learnt the number 18 bus timetable, because the driver every Friday night brings them a tin of dog food to start to share with them. And raccoons become dependent on the city, and we take our world away, and they're no longer able to survive. But far from being pests, they're actually new kinds of city recyclers, turning our trash to compost, and perhaps they should be encouraged further into our cities. What would that start to look like? So we begin to see new creatures, perhaps a result of a parasitic tech infection or the mutant offspring of engineered specimen interbreeding. This lame creature darts to the safety of the shadows to munch on its prey. She had her binoculars slung around her neck. The first lab birds we saw in the brave new now are a flock of gaseous canaries, and their joyful notes are the first to salute our ear. So high above the rooftop vents drift the green-throated sentinel canaries that are bioengineered to be sensitive to increased levels of CO2. I read the excerpt from our Singing Sentinels birdwatching guidebook. When in the presence of high levels of carbon dioxide, these birds' plumage phase shifts to an extraordinary emerald color. Coal gulls can be found in gatherings around the remaining coal-burning power stations and carbon sequestration centers. Take a fire extinguisher with you to draw them out of the trees. A note of caution is necessary when calling and tracking these birds, evidenced by the ongoing litigation against a BBC documentary team for frivolous chemical spraying. The luminous plumage of the rose-shift canaries catch the sun as they fan their tails and sing sharply in the clouds of nutrients. Coal miners once hammered rock to the twitter of canaries that lived beside them. Their changing birdsong once warned of an alarm against a dangerous gas leak. And echoing across the landscapes of the brave new now, we can start to imagine a designed infrastructure of singing sentinels as bioengineered birds once again monitor the air for us. Altered birdsong sings out as a soundtrack to the Anthropocenic spaces of tomorrow, an elegy for a changing planet. And through the flocks of engineered birds, we glimpse the clouds beyond. Sharing their skies are drifting flocks of artificial clouds. Just like bats, they are sensitive to high-frequency signals. We dial up a few with our tweet decks. They rain in our neighbour's barbecue and mud up the soil for a music festival slip inside. We start to imagine a natural gardener's protest movement that cuts them down and sets the hydrogen-filled bodies alight. They are powered perhaps through a hydrogen fuel cell generating lift through the electrolysis of water. We can interface with this new designed robotic nature on our phones, emitting different tones of sound, calling them near or pushing them away in acoustic forms of weather control. And the sun is setting now, and above us the night air rumbles to the low hum of a flickering swarm of cybernetic fireflies that play above the rooftops. As a mobile network infrastructure, the flock broadcasts its signal in a luminescent cloud that fades in and out over the city. And following the intensity of electromagnetic spectrums, they map their network strength across the sky as we look up in wonder, our faces bright in the rolling glow of a Wi-Fi aurora. And what it suggests is that in this brave new now city, certain infrastructures are perhaps becoming mobile. When we think of these robotic works developed in tourist thoughts today, we think of them as a new kind of infrastructure, where the mechanisms of the city are exploded into dynamic systems, swarms and flocks capable of embedding themselves within the cycles of landscape and the environment around. We start to relate to them in a more intimate way, rather than infrastructure and industry which typically exists out on the periphery. And we start to think about the internet as another kind of city. In the brave new now, the internet is not a cloud city of ephemeral webs and endless connections, but it's a physical city distributed across the planet, where a 75-year-old woman scavenging for copper from her garden cuts off the whole of the internet to Armenia. It's a new kind of wilderness, a new sort of city with a very real physicality. 60 grams is the weight of the internet if measured in electrons, or 182,500 tons if measured by the weight of servers that powers it. The internet is a machine that consumes 5% of the world's power. The internet is responsible for 2% of global carbon emissions, the same as Argentina. It's a web of shadows and blackouts managed by companies or nation states, where 3 men arrested off Alexandria are accused of trying to cut the internet to the whole of Egypt by sabotaging an undersea cable called CWEME4. The US military have developed aerial systems to force the internet on dictators who have closed down or censored their own network. It's an instant internet city as a form of weaponized connectivity. And this same tech is now not just in the hands of the military. In the skies, we see flocks of birds dancing, but with them we see drifting on the thermals a new system of internet creatures, where infrastructure has exploded into bits to roam the earth in an architecture of everywhere, a kind of open source sky. Here in the brave new now, we see a flickering flock of pirate internet drones scan across the skyline. drone jockeys conduct a flock of autonomous, interactive drones that form their own place-specific local Wi-Fi community and pirate file-sharing network. It's a kind of aerial Napster, or a drifting pirate bay. They perform a balletic aerial choreography as their soft glow reflects in the glass of the city, part nomadic infrastructure and part robotic swarm. They come into formation, forming their network, reasserting place and geography on the web, and then disperse, only to reform elsewhere within the city. They are part city infrastructure and part technological creature living amongst the rooftops. These new forms of infrastructure in the brave new now suggest new forms of community. It is a time when the city itself is in question. We are much closer now to our virtual community than we are to our physical neighbours. The Egyptian revolution was a community formed through a network. As Brent Hammersley says, Al-Qaeda is just a mailing list with a weapons budget. This death of physical place, this death of distance and geography has created new forms of city, based on what we're interested in. Our culture, the push for revolution in the Middle East, or a love of 90s boy bands. We tickle our iPads and our iPhones. We block out the world with our iTunes and our iPods, and these are all our I needs and our I wants, and we stare on in wonder watching iPlayer as we locate ourselves in cities and spaces, not through sight lines and orientation points and street axes, but through glowing rectangles and dancing fingers. So we no longer define ourselves by our physical location in space. We are brave new now nodes, and we are both our digital selves and our physical selves. So at the resolution of Google Earth, a pixel is just a bit bigger than the width of our body. So at this public resolution, we don't see us. We are a discoloration, a smudge, thoroughly embedded in the grain of technology, indistinguishable from the city and the technology that surrounds us. Just like this little bastard, Justin Bieber. You can't think of him as just an ordinary 19-year-old kid. To understand people like him and increasingly people like us, you've got to look not just at him, but at the media created around him and by him. And Kevin Warwick, another friend we meet in the Brave New Now, he implants a chip into his arm and a transmitter into the LED jewellery of his wife, the poor woman standing here on the right. Now her necklace glows red every time her husband gets an erection. And Victoria Beckham, another augmented being, preened and plucked, puckered and liposucked into a new nature version of a mother of three. And me, with a plate that holds my head together from an operation when I was born. And from in this world, the physicality and the biology of the body is in question, and the MRI scan becomes a new site for a prosthetic infrastructure at the scale of the void spaces of the body. And in between my intestinal tract and spine, we see an internal biocomputing prosthetic that we start to imagine being developed for the cloud computing world. So perhaps we could augment our bodies, ourselves to operate in this new digital landscape. We tattoo it to ourselves with conductive ink that animates the skin with a new tribal ornamentation generated from magnetic fields of our own internal Wi-Fi antennas. And digital connectivity perhaps becomes a part of the natural mineralization processes of the body as our unique IP addresses fossilize like the bones within us. He showed me his photo from the instant portrait endoscopy booth. This picture was going straight on the wall. He looked down at the flickering ornamentation on his chest as his conductive ink tattoo took on the form of a wireless field of digital broadcasts. And through electrical impulses, we could sense the virtual interactions of the crowd and a new infrastructure of collective computation. He holds in his hand the unique mineralized implant of a lost loved one. He would never forget her broadcasts. And his star signs said his favorite satellite was below the horizon tonight. He hated this time of year. He had always loved his IP address. He just had to touch it. He cut it out and held it in his hand and marveled at its intricacies. So now as we finish our tour, we have come from the wilds of the jungle to the intimacy of our own bodies, and we take a rest on the couch in the ordinary spaces of the living room. And so as the sun sets on the brave new now, the suburban aurora begins to glow and flickering screens illuminate the faces of Twitterers, Facebookers and Google Explorers. And our houses, perhaps they also now are becoming the front lines of robotics innovation. So here we see a strange creature living in the home, whirring and sucking, consuming dust, an endless appetite, a dustbag stomach that must be emptied every 3 weeks, and the cat rides the robot vacuum cleaner, and we're not really sure which one is our pet anymore. And the toilet that cleans us as we sit. It warms our ass, it tells us the time and diagnoses our health and connects us to the web. It is comforting to know that these intriguing unnatural specimens have made it here with us. After nature, their songs still sound, the LEDs flash and their cooling fans spin. So, our journey through the brave new now has taken us across the earth, from the hole in the ground to the point of consumption, through landscapes at the scale of the electron, which affect landscapes the scale of the planet. But we realize that there is no nature anymore. There is no city, or perhaps there is cityness everywhere. What we see is technology, engineered systems, augmented environments, and invisible fields. It's important to travel to these places, both in fiction and in reality. In this project we now watch on the screen, I released 100 canaries into a sealed gallery space in the Netherlands. And slowly I increased the levels of CO2 in the gallery in line with predicted increases if our culture continues without change. His interior is a model of a kind of accelerated climate change. And against the rise in CO2, as a performance I narrate the predicted developments of technology, the wonders of possible progress. In 50 years, the birds are no longer singing. If we listen, we are strolling towards a silent spring. So when I walk through the brave new now city, perhaps we see as designers and architects, as artists, as practitioners, we can start to imagine instigating new cultural relationships with the inevitable byproducts of industry, a changing climate in the Anthropocenic world. We can start to imagine objects, interiors, interfaces with kind of designed shadows that stretch across the planet. And can we design the shadows instead, where objects, interiors, buildings, devices just kind of coalesce like a cloud condensing around engineered systems of flows, streams, and ecologies? Reimagining how we interact with these systems. Imagining choreographic objects, relational objects, atomized, a kind of distributed architecture, reprogramming the world, generating new encounters and relationships with the complexities of a global context rather than an individual site or product. So some of the people we meet on our walk through the brave new now are swept up in what the city could be. Others are reserved and look on with caution. It is a place of wonder and of fear. We make friends, we hear their stories, and we share their lives. The city is vast and wondrous and strange. In the brave new now, we look out over the gold price etched into an artificial Grand Canyon, while a cat rides a robot vacuum cleaner, and we take a shit on a toilet that asks us how our day is. The city is vast and wondrous and strange. Thanks. Oh, let's do the chairs.
Make some space. We have more space on the stage. Wow. Wow. Thank you very much for this journey. A little bit dizzy. A lot of areas, a lot of examples. And maybe I take myself a little another thought and give the space and time to our another guest, which I give a very warm welcome. Thank you very much, Ellingsen, for coming here tonight to join us. You both met in London. You both work in the field of education, like as you know from the information about Liam's practice, he is teaching at the AA and in Princeton. He is taking to his unknown fields division students. He organizes, thanks to the AA's program, visiting school, his students to a lot of areas and places worldwide. So do you. We invited you today to be here, our guest, because of your teaching and co-director position at the Institut für Raumexperimente in Berlin, that actually tomorrow comes to an end. It's an Institut für Raumexperimente and an experiment itself. We did not really believe it until you confirmed this to us earlier, that it's really tomorrow the end of that journey of a very special education, where you also go into practice, where you engage storytelling, fiction, experiment, construction and deconstruction of realities with your students. But you probably can much better explain how you work with some examples, and then maybe react on what Liam just presented us. Thanks.
Hi. I'm Eric Ellingsen. Thanks, Liam. I really appreciated this. It's really refreshing. I also come from in architecture. I have an architecture and a landscape architecture background and classical philosophy, and so to see these things blend together into narratives and with kind of a real ecological urgency, I find I always find it super inspiring. Julie asked me to talk a little bit about the Institute. I don't have so much time, so I won't take so much time to do this, maybe 10 minutes or so. And a little bit of how we structure our experiments in the Institute and sort of that kind of methodology that kind of discovered itself in the uncertainty and kind of embraced that uncertainty and a kind of, with a shared vulnerability that we would sort of build out of the constraints of putting people together and then sort of basically manipulating those constraints so that we all share that experience. I mean, as you know, philosopher of scientists Stephen Chafin talks about the sort of the roots in French of experiment and experiments. Experience and experiments are the same. And so to have experiments that you can experience, if you don't have that, you're sort of something is not being reflected on with an immediacy of sort of that contact and touch and feeling with the world and the systems that you're either reiterating or reproducing or strengthening or critiquing. And so that touching, those feeling, those systems is really important, which is I also think will go right back into Liam's work as well. And I want to do one or two things together as well with you. So maybe we could try that now, because it really comes. I just find this is really important. It's also how we operate at the school. We sort of all do something together to create that experience that we can share, and then from that experience, that vulnerability of, as I was saying. Then reflect on it critically. So this comes from a little experiment that the idea behind it was this thing that Heidegger says in Being and Time. He says that the chair that leans against the wall it's not touching the wall. The chair that's leaning against the wall, right? So it's really touching the wall. They're not touching because they're not encounterable to each other. So there's something, he says, there's something that is different between just two things meeting and then that encounter, that encounterability. And so how do we encounter the systems that we're doing? If the cell phone is in my pocket and it's touching me, but I don't have a contact with those systems that are organizing those materials, that I can encounter the intensity of those systems and the organization of those systems, there is no contact. I mean, I'm using these things are using me, we're perpetuating each other's kind of existence in a way, but that encounterability isn't there. So that encounterability is really important. So we'll start with one. If everyone would, can I do this? Is that all right? So we stand up, if you would.
Do we do it too?
Yeah, sure. And the idea is just, if you would, you have to spread out just a little bit. You close your eyes. You put your hands out your sides, a little bit like airplane wings. And you face your fingers, let's say, perpendicular to your body. You close your eyes, and the idea is that you would be able to, you keeping your elbows straight, you try to touch the two fingertips together. And keep doing it until you succeed. So I mean, if you keep doing it, if you haven't gotten it, if you keep doing it, you will. I mean, the idea. I mean, these come from, and this is also how we build that into the school. I'll try one of them, and I'll explain both. Actually, if you would stay standing, just one more time. This is another fingertip. This is called a floating finger, and I will lead this into a description of a story that also goes into Berlin. So this one is if you put your fingertips not quite touching, and you focus on something beyond your hands. So you're focusing on something beyond your hands, and at the same time you're moving your body just enough so that you should see the two index fingertips floating like a sausage. Do you see that kind of detached?
Oh yeah.
Right. So what you can start to do, this is also called the sausage finger experiment. What you can start to do is you can start to actually then move these things up. You can move the thing that's not there, that you're staring at, up and down and sort of manipulate that. So for instance, okay, we can sit down. So just to go into, I'll just contextualize this one more time and then go more into the school. So for instance, this was a walk that I did. It was the last walk we did in the school 3 weeks ago using the sausage fingers. and basically, I also have a practice called Species of Space, and this comes from Perec, and I'll bring this up in a minute again. But the idea is basically that you could, what we did was everyone, maybe 30 of us, were leaving the building. We were located in Pfefferberg, so the first thing we did is an institute. It's affiliated with the UDK, so about 70% of our artists in the school are getting also degrees from the University of the Arts, and it's funded half by the German state and half by the Einstein Stiftung, and then we raise money through different foundations like the Turn and things like this for special projects. But essentially what we all did, and we've been doing this since the 5 years ago when we started, is that we take these walks together and sort of we move through the city in different ways so that we can experience and feel ourselves as we're moving through the city. We can actually have a kind of understanding of ourselves as participating in those systems, and feeling how our body can sort of slow down and shift and have to orient itself within these environments. So for the sausage fingers, we led about 30 to 40 people out of the building and around a nearby park and then back. And the thing is that everyone had to hold their fingers out in front of them. So you become a kind of a little bit of a sacrifice to the spectacle in a sense. But at the same time, it's not how you look, it's how you look, right? I mean, because you're actually suddenly become very aware of focusing on something that you're creating by looking, and at the same time that you have to pay attention to the things that are around you immediately, or else you're going to get hit by a car or run into other people and things like this. So you have to really sort of sensitively adjust your speeds and sort of your body within that cloud of people that are moving down the street. And at the same time, you have to, I ask is that people sort of try to pay attention, and this changes depending on the walk, to the language that they find around them. Most of the stuff is, languages have been commodified and we're just being advertised to us over and over again, and we're not aware of the sort of implications of that, maybe in our imagination and in our narratives when we're writing these kinds of sort of scenarios, or even just understanding the reality of what's happening on a day-to-day basis as well, more immediately in our families and our relationships and things. So to be able to pay attention to something that's not really there, that you're creating by looking, and at the same time navigating the environment around you, and with a swarm of people that are doing this, suddenly puts you into a relationship where you start to adjust your speeds, your attention, your awareness, and sort of your perception of that place in a completely different way. You notice things that you don't notice before. And so what I'll do, I do this with my partner who comes from urbanism and food systems and agriculture, is that we rent the vendors from Alexanderplatz, the grill walkers. And I'll do this in exhibitions, or in workshops. So for instance, the walk starts in school. This is part of a pedagogical sort of methodology that we're always building these walks, perceptual-based walks. And then these things go into our own practices in different ways. So for me, and for each of the artists, this is very different. For me, what I did was I started to get interested in these systems. Like Berlin hires 17 full-time hunters year-round to hunt wildschwein, foxes, and waschbars, the raccoons. They hire 70 part-time hunters year-round to also hunt these, and this is within the kind of Berlin city radius. And so what we do is we've worked with the Department of Forestry. We buy a wildschwein hunted in the city. My wife works with a butcher. We make sausages out of these. We put them on the grill walker. We walk through the city, and at the same time, we're doing this sausage finger experiment. So suddenly, all this kind of converges. Then anyone that comes up, because if you're 30 people walking through the city like this, people are curious, and then you're giving away food, and people are eating the thing that eats the city, and so you're actually tasting the place, and you actually are aware, I think, like a lot of the scenarios you're talking about. I mean, you are aware that this is not the place that's sort of outside of what you are biologically, physically. I mean, we're 95%, our DNA is other organisms. So, to sort of feel ourselves as a sort of also a kind of convergence of these systems around us. And then you can bring in all the lore, like Lorraine Dostin talks about from the Max Planck in her book on wonders. I mean, radioactivity grounds in the south of Germany, and the pigs and the wildschwein are eating these, and then they're wandering up into the Schwarzwald. And then this also sets off alarms of our perceptions of what's toxic, what's not toxic, what's allowed in the city, what's nature, where these things can sort of be crossed. And so in a way, that's one, let's say, I'll go back to the school now, but that's one instance in which we set up these experiments that we all kind of build together, and then these things go into our practices differently. And it happens from myself, or Olafur Eliasson, who started the school, or Christina Werner, who comes more from curation and sort of social sciences. And all these things then get reflected back into a practice that basically comes from that idea in the school, which is that kind of encounterability. Once you feel that encounterability, you become aware and responsible for, and you can kind of start to play within these systems with a different kind of ethical orientation, perhaps, or different sort of that kind of urgency that's needed past just the possibilities of what can be done. It's that risk society, right, that Ulrich Beck talks about. Not just that we can do it, so we do it. We step away from necessarily what can be done because things need to be done in a certain way. So the school, I'm sorry, I'm going very quickly through this, but the school's really interesting. I mean, we started 5 years ago. We were given a really quite a beautiful permission by the University of the Arts to sort of basically run our own experiment and then close after 5 years. So it was a little bit like a biology lab, in which along the way we would critique ourselves, and we would sort of set up a dialogue in which we would bring in people from the outside, and we were responsible for, on the one hand, experimenting with new methodologies and what is learning today, and how, you know, what is the learning and of art in the 21st century, and then how could we create models, not necessarily that would get imitated, but that could be, so let's say they could be critical of what would be more sensitive depending on the school or the department or the discipline that would want to be experimenting. And what we learned really quickly was, of course, not many people, we all know the value of experiments, but to know how to experiment is actually quite hard. And so we set up things like walks, which we do over and over again, and build from that a kind of common shared experience. So some of these walks have ranged from bringing in someone like Alice Waters, who works really closely in food systems around the world, and then we all go together to Alexanderplatz, and everyone has to do a smell walk back home. So everyone basically, you have to go in the direction of the most prominent smell that crosses your environment. So again, your speeds change. You hit a cloud of perfumes, and you're sort of dragged along, and then you have to sort of orient yourself with cigarette smoke, with exhaust from cars, and you basically have a kind of goal in mind. You want to get back to the school to sort of go in that experience, and you get caught in these little cavitation cycles, you know, these like the ocean gyres or something like this, and you kind of have to find a way to either you know, how closely you can stay with the person that you like the smell and is going in the right direction, or how far off of a tangent you will get. And so it becomes this kind of situationist-like drift that you're not in charge of where you're going. You're not scripting ahead of time a predetermined route. You're just kind of, you're going within those systems that are crossing your path at the same time with some kind of control and basically some kind of parameters on how you move. So, for instance, I think a lot of what Liam was talking about, if you go into a really fundamental definition of ecology from ecologists, I get this from Daniel Buchan, you know, it's energy flowing and cycling material. So as energy flows, the material cycles, and that material takes new forms, whether it's a snowflake, an ice crystal, or a population of a species, or, you know, a manufacturing of gold to go into a phone. And so to suddenly become aware of those systems, and again, this is where Perret comes in, you know, to how do we have contact with those systems so that we can renegotiate the terms of those systems? He writes this in his book, Species of Spaces. So that was really important as a pedagogy of the school, was to build these experiments. And what we ended up doing was then incorporating the visions of the artists in the school into those projects. They would design them with us, and we would all sort of do them together. At the same time, we were taking, as you mentioned, Julia, we were taking trips together. We were living together, we were working together, and we were traveling together. So last year we set up an experiment where we lived in Ethiopia for 10 weeks together in Addis Ababa and worked with local art groups there, poetry groups there, and then built a satellite school in the University of the Arts. We basically taught classes together. We used each other's resources, and we built each other sort of that experience together, and then we did exhibitions and performances and things. And with the artists in the school, we all lived together in a compound, and so we saw each other in that sort of reiterated dailiness of not having a formal setting in which you say, now you're learning, now you're not learning. You're just kind of always learning, and you can redirect that curriculum or that kind of learning on a very immediate level with a one-to-one with a person within their trajectory. I mean, this is very different, I think, from art and architecture, is that basically we had to design, you know, if we have 30 artists in the school, we design 30 different curriculums based upon each person in that school somehow. So that kind of sort of intimacy and that time together also allows us to sort of build a language where we can bring people in, as I was saying with Alice Waters or Lorraine Dawson or someone like this, talk about their fields of expertise and their skills and their tools, and then sort of help to attach those to the practices of the artist so they can develop a critical language with whatever direction they want to go. I mean, other things. I don't know how much quite to go into the school. I mean, we have. I mean, archives are very important to us. So very much like you're talking about these inscriptions on the bullets, perhaps. We have a site now that's relatively new. It came out about a year ago, and this will sort of carry that archive together. And it's most of the lectures, most of the presentations, and most of the experiments and exhibitions are on this. So I would really encourage you to go into that. But I guess, you know, for the school, what was really important is that we didn't know what we didn't make a syllabus until after we were finished. I mean, we didn't know where we were. We allowed ourselves that not knowing where we were going, and from that not knowing where we were going, and then having that kind of trust from places like the UDK that said, okay, you know, there's going to be some accountability if you don't do anything with this. But you know, to basically build a shared trust together, and out of that shared trust together, be able to conduct experiments that could fail or that could sort of risk needing to constantly retune themselves to find why you're doing them. And we did this together for 5 years, and every time we got very sort of confident or good at one thing, we would very intentionally change it or stop doing it so that we would go back into a place that we weren't familiar with. And that was just really important. I mean, that sort of organized the entire 5 years. In terms of the, well, I don't, how am I doing? Is that pretty good?
I know that there is one, like how fiction, like what we heard from Liam, how does that enter to deal with reality, like to build up realities? Like I was reading and following the parliaments, the different parliaments of reality, and how much does fiction enter in that practice?
You know, quite a bit. I mean, it frees up. I think it frees you up. I mean, it doesn't detach you. It somehow, I think, it reconnects you in sort of unpredictable and improbable ways. So, for instance, the Tempelhof 2 summers ago had a World's Fair. It was a World's Not Fair fair. It was organized by Raumlabor and the Hebel Amufa, and they were attempting to basically prevent a kind of development from happening in one of these megastructures, from taking over Tempelhof in the future. So they were sort of, in a way, being a little more activist, not just sort of critiquing, I think, what they didn't want to happen. They built up something out of 10 to 12 different artist groups or architecture groups to sort of say how else that space could be occupied in a self-organized way. And one of the things we ended up doing was kind of combining that reality with the fiction. So, for instance, we, instead of building, I think we were the only group to really do this. Instead of building a new pavilion, Christina Werner and I, and then really Christina took this over, ended up preserving a balloon hall there. This was a balloon hall that was really important to the airfield at one time. It still has asbestos siding and things, and but they were going to demolish it, and it has, and yet it has this very sort of significant historical aspect in the sort of in the history of the interior of the field. So we ended up building a sort of furniture inside of that could be moved inside and outside. And by doing this, that's still there, and so that sort of changed the reality of the politics of that place a little bit. And then we had to meet it in other ways. This kind of, you know, each of the artists in the school did installations over that course of the month, and we did 4 days a week for 4 weeks, so 16 different days, 8 hours a day of different programming. So we were constantly doing this with performances and installations and walks, and they would invite different publics in different ways. So the reality was to do this in a place that was outside, let's say, of a normal art audience that was coming just for that, because Tempelhof catches just huge, you know, populations of people in the neighborhoods that surrounding it, and also from tourism, and somehow also sort of engaging with those publics, because public is such a generic thing anyway. Public space is such a, so the publics in a way that could sort of retune itself specifically to those people and those groups as they came through. So somehow the reality was actually helping to define what our options were, and then we were responding to that with a kind of fiction of, you know, one of the artists, two of the artists hired people that had worked in the film industry to set off explosives. and you didn't quite know where this is going to happen, and then there's just large explosions in the middle of the infield. And that kind of fiction of what happened, is there something happening here? Because you're not allowed to dig because there's still artillery, perhaps, in this field. They haven't done these kind of surveys yet that would to find out what's there and what's not there. And so there is this kind of lore that you can play with, and you can kind of build off something that's, and yet it's a real explosion. So there is a reality to the thing that's happening that's dangerous. It's just you're having to sort of explain that reality to yourself if you're a certain distance from it, and what it could be, and then you have to investigate it if you feel a sort of threat or risk. So somehow all these things were converging. I think we were doing this, at least our attempt was to do that the whole time. I mean, as Olafur really says over and over, I mean, we're reality-producing machines. I mean, art is reality producers. They're not something that stands outside of that world and then sort of imagines it as different. It acts different, and then that changes the reality. So this is also sort of very important for the school. I mean, can I ask you, because I would just go into a question too. I mean, because it's really interesting, because this goes into the reality. It's also how some of these systems are represented, like the Aboriginal songlines in Australia. There's a book called Wild by Jay Griffith. She's a writer in London that also writes for Radiohead's magazine and stuff. And she says everyone misses the songlines point, because everyone talks about how the lines are also geographically telling what your directions are and sort of communicating with the landscape around, which way to go as you're moving. And they're also songs, so they're also art, and but she says what people miss when they recommunicate that story is it's also the law. So the law is being preserved in those stories. And she says what's really important is that if you forget some of that detail, because for the Aborigines, when you sing that law, you're then renegotiating that law. That law becomes more, it's not liquid, but it's malleable, right? It's not something just fixed, because you're then singing that law and you can sort of redefine those lyrics. And so the question would be, it's because it's really, in doing these narratives, especially mixing with the fiction, I mean, how to exploit the sort of imagination of those systems, but at the same time to preserve those really sort of nuanced realities that are, at least for her, she said this was the important thing, because this was the parliament. I mean, that was the reality, was that the laws were being reconstituted each time they were sung, and a kind of social agreement and contract was being affirmed or negotiated because you were singing, and not just a kind of transportation of a story, but also transportation of a story. So I'm curious, when you're picking up these images of the cat and these kinds of systems, how much do you feel that you can riff off them or go away from them or responsible to it, because you're also talking about the spatial realities, as you said at the beginning of your talk?
Yeah, I've got my thing. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just to go back to the songlines for a second. Like the gold artifacts project, which is done by a student of mine and Kate's, Aaron Muradian, and he was interested in. We spent time on our expedition through Australia with language archivists. I mean, what's interesting is there is no written tradition in Aboriginal culture. It's all spoken. It's all oral histories. So the question of archive is really intriguing, because the nature of those stories do fundamentally change across time. And what we saw happening, what people have documented within Australia, is that these songs sung of Dreamtime stories become woven and evolved with contemporary narratives and new technologies. I think I'm going to get it wrong, but I think the kind of billowing clouds coming in off the water became woven into a story, and what they were referring to were the tall ships of British colonization coming in. So these things, they're fundamental in their makeup is the possibility that they can change and evolve, that they can incorporate new narratives, that they can shift. The question of how you archive that was an intriguing one. I mean, they now use digital technologies to create spoken word databases that constantly evolve. There's a whole complex taboo structures and laws which mean that only certain people can hear certain stories, so they start to have different access levels on digital databases that allow you to get into different stories. But think it's a really interesting example to talk about the way that cultural narratives are productively open, right? And how we can actually start to play with that and tune it to particular ends. Like I used to tell this story all the time, but Kate and I were on a panel with Kate I run Unknown Fields with at the AA. We were on a panel with a few guys from Greenpeace, and they were talking about models of conservation tactics, right? And the dominant model of ecology was one of bearing witness for the last couple of decades, right? You know, you would go out into the world, you would see a reality, you know, the penguins covered in oil, you would document that and bring it back into the world and present it, you know, and that knowledge or awareness of what's going on out there would stop us driving the SUV, would make us put on a jumper rather than turning the heat up. But obviously that's bullshit. It's not happening, right? Like we know the penguins are covered in oil. We know all this shit's going on, but that's not productive for change. What they're trying to talk about, what they're starting to do now, they're doing less of the bangers draped across oil rigs. They're talking about counter narratives, that their role is no longer just going out and bearing witness, but is going out into the world, collecting these stories, but repositioning them and representing them and presenting them within counter narratives that starts to present other ways of being and other ways of thinking about them, you know. And I think that's kind of what we try and do with our use of expedition and our use of site and place and these artifacts from the world, is to try and reposition them in new stories, to start to suggest alternative ways of relating to them, not as predictions but as provocations, right? So I think it's, you know, that's a critical part of the storytelling for us. It's a critical part of our engagement with reality in this context for us is putting together these pieces in such a way that tells something else. You know?
Yeah, I mean that's why I liked this. Your opening with the Lagette images. I mean, you know, because the role of the image in that work is so important in terms of the stories, and I imagine it's so that people can basically compose the stories also relevant to them. I mean, they can identify with the story you're telling, but the listener is also composing that story in a way, and then co-authoring that story. And that whole movie, of course, is made up of still images. I mean, what is this the role of the image in the work that you're also doing? I mean, the power that. Yeah,
I mean, there's like that data dramatization phrase that I used in the introduction is really critical in this context for us. I mean, we do a lot of robotic projects like the flying internet stuff and things like that, which land us in certain media art festivals and conferences and programs, alongside huge swathes of data visualization guys, right? I never really was aware of that genre before I started to do those kind of projects. There is massive community of artists around the world that visualize data in particular ways, graphs making them look sexy, but their role is to try and present super complex information in ways that we can digest. Our provocation to move away from an idea of data visualization to data dramatization is to suggest ways that you can position an audience in emotional relationships with that content. It's not just about being able to digest it or understand it, it's about being able to connect with it. In the same way that you're talking about chairs and walls, you know, how can you actually form emotional responses to these things, you know? And I think that's the role of the image or the animation or the film for us that's also the role of fiction in a way, is to start to suggest forms of engagement where we can elicit you know, meaningful responses and emotional responses, right? Like, you know, speculative projects about the possibilities and implications of biotechnology take what is sometimes a very abstract talking heads conversation on BBC News about a new development in gene sequencing that is still, we understand it, but it's still kind of in the abstract. And you play it out through possible scenarios about what this technology could mean, what it could do, and all of a sudden an abstract idea that we're forced to form relationships to in the context of the Bible or abstract ethical positions, we can start to develop other kind of relationships too when we see it in an image or in a scenario or presented in a way that we can start to connect with. You know? And I think that's the role of image making, that's the role of fiction, that's the role of the animation, is to use storytelling to provide the platform for those more nuanced responses and relationships.
Yeah, maybe before I pass on the voice to the audience, maybe there are some questions. There is a question that was raised and maybe not fully answered in the past sessions that we had here on Wednesdays. Like we had different forms of theater, different strategies and different outcomes, and we are facing reality. And I would like to know who engages with you and your tactics, like who finances, who are your partners, who brings that to a realization stage, what you call fictional speculations as critical instruments, like who are your clients, who is out there who wants to survey reality?
Yeah, I feel this thing. Yeah, I mean, our expeditions, we don't, Unknown Fields doesn't rely on any large private sponsorship. Like we have a group of research students that kind of get grants and apply for their own funding in order to come with us. So they're entirely self-funded in a way, all these expeditions. We do it because we think it's important. I suppose we operate within the Architectural Association in London, which gives us a kind of a framework and an institutional platform from which to operate. But the actual expeditions themselves are self-initiated and self-funded for the most part, and that keeps us relatively independent. It means that we can decide to go to any particular place or location purely because we think it's interesting. There's no commercial imperative behind it. You know, we're not, to use the media artist example again, we don't work with Nike, you know, because they're really interested in this particular context or place and they want us to do a film, so they say, hey, you want to do a film, so we've got to kind of go and look at Nike factories because they're the guys paying the ticket. We go out and we explore these territories because we think it's urgent or interesting. Which is bloody difficult, but it allows us to operate with a degree of autonomy. I mean, we beg, borrow and steal to make these expeditions happen. We kind of plead for reduced fares on airlines, and you try and get in the door to certain places we normally wouldn't be able to. So we do have kind of some version of commercial partnerships in that sense, but they're really enablers. In that context, they're not commissioners. So we stand outside of the traditional model of commissioning. Tomorrow Sorts Today, as a practice, operates in some form as a consultancy, but it's also it operates essentially as an art practice. We do installations and events funded by galleries and curators that are interested in doing a project. But they're all self-initiated within the context of the studio. So my description of the think tank as a model for an architectural practice is to try and investigate a new funding model which doesn't rely on client-based contract systems. You know, so we self-initiate projects. The electronic countermeasures flying internet project was an idea we had that came out of the Arab Spring context, and we looked for a funding body that would be interested in putting money into it. So it's purely self-initiated, and we rely on a network of extraordinary people to give us the space to do that and to trust us enough to spend their money without putting any strings around it. So that model of the self-initiated project, I think, is really, really fundamental to what we do, and allows us to ask the questions that we want to ask. Yeah, I mean, what I think I'd be super interested to. I mean, it's a conversation about business models that we so rarely have, but the hoops through which we jump to allow us to do the things that we genuinely want to do, I think, is really interesting, and how everyone has their own strategies for doing that. I'm sure you've got tactics for pulling that off.
Yeah,
as well.
I just like to remember that when I first met you and I got to know what you're doing in your projects, and you said, "Well, Julia, this is just mainstream," and I was like, "What?" And then you said, "Yeah, look at the architects. Who of the architects is still building and designing? You know, everyone. It's now about speculation. So speculation is the mainstream. So this is just one kind, and also your role as a curator and artist." In all of your shows, you just open up this panorama. What is there that has nothing to do with building or designing a building and bringing it to stage?
Yeah.
So that was just so all these initiatives is reality right now. And what is another reality? When I saw the drones or the flying objects, I just got to know about one project near Alexanderplatz to design a building in which we can all fly. So actually, the fictions that you tell are being currently designed, and there is a competition. And let's see who of the big names in Berlin's architecture scene will win that competition to build a building in which we can all fly around. So yeah, I mean, if you have another question,
I would just, because it also reminded me of the way you're working and talking about funding, and also this combination of fiction. I don't know if you know David Edgars. He's an American novelist that's also won a Pulitzer Prize, and one of his last projects, because it was really a project working within these different systems and to build a fiction that was sort of responsible for the stories that it was telling. It was a book called "What Is the What," and it's set in Ethiopia and Sudan in terms of refugee camps, and it tells a story of one character that goes from there to the U.S. But essentially, what he does is he created an organization that could go down and archive the oral histories of thousands of people in terms of these places, and then start to combine those stories into a certain set of characters that could kind of compress those stories into a one line that could be followed by a reader. But as you're doing that, so you have a fictional character based on a completely sort of conglomerate of realities. And at the same time, and this is also, I just think this is the last thing I would say, is the really importance of again going back to those systems that are organizing those spaces, because all those different rules or all those different constraints is an ecology that starts to shape the flow of resources and materials that gives rise to these kind of self-organized structures. And one of the ones that he talks about, which I always found amazing, and it is spatial, which is why I thought, I still believe it's really relevant from an architectural, landscape, urbanistic point of view, is how the refugees they realized they each got these different cards that allowed them to have a certain number of meal tickets, a certain allowance each day that was being provided from global sort of initiatives and funding sources. And essentially they could create a whole kind of alternative economy from these cards, because the kids would sneak outside the gate, go hike 3 days in another direction, come back in, give another name, get another card. And so within a very short time, what they had was these alternative economies that was really circulating, and around a whole other secondhand of goods. And with that, they were able to purchase things, bring things in, and sort of reorganize as commodities, things coming into that area. And what I found really interesting with the Dave Edgars book is that that's what he's doing as well, with going into these places, collecting these stories and collecting these kind of, and then building that and then revaluing them so that there's an upcycling of a value, and what he's producing is worth. It has an integrity that's attached to the systems, like the Aboriginal songlines, but at the same time, it's kind of then investing alternatives or propositions that connects you back into the world and makes you realize that this is all sort of organizing space around us, just like the refugee camps that are also in Berlin. And one last thing, I just wanted to, because I didn't say why you did this. If you do that again, the fingers, the idea was that you can never actually unlearn that. I mean, it's a haptic thing. And so once you do that, and once your body trains to do that, you should be able to try it again tomorrow. And essentially do it in less time than it took you the first time. So it has worked when I do this before. It should also work a year from now or 2 years from now, so that you would be able to, so that experience of doing that is that something that then gets kind of embedded in that body memory as a system that sort of is learning as it's doing that. I just didn't want you to leave wondering, why did I don't know why I did that. So that's all.
Okay, so yeah, questions or comments are very welcome. Also doubts and disagreements.
Hi. So I think these kind of images that you produce, so these kind of, how do you call it, provocative, worlds. I think you can either see them as a utopia or as a dystopia. So it can be this very strong influence of technology, of technological devices and stuff. So it can be, I think people can, according to their preferences, see that very positive or negative. So when you are exploring these new fields and when you are somehow developing these worlds, do you have the impression that you yourself, it influences you in a way that you see the world rather more optimistic or pessimistic?
It's funny. I mean, the work I would hope is kind of playing with this idea of there's a sort of productive ambiguity, right? That it sits somewhere between an aspirational vision of the world and a cautionary tale, and that it sits in that productive space in between that asks an audience to make up their own mind. That different people will read into it in different ways, right? Like if I talk about if I show the same project in one context, then someone will call me a techno-optimist, and how can I think that technology is going to save the world? In another kind of context, they ask, why is it so dystopian, and why, couldn't technology start to be productive in some form? So it's really about exploring that space in between, and the ambiguous position is kind of useful. When we do go on these expeditions, you see extraordinary things that you can't help but take in, like with the image of the young girl playing outside her father's workshop / living room / bedroom / kitchen / mine site is really quite confronting. The last summer's expedition was to Madagascar, famously the world's poorest country, and it wears its poverty very visibly. And to take a group of what in some senses are very privileged research students into this context to develop work is really difficult. How you actually manage that. The work does tend to take us into these pockets where you're forced into those encounters, and they stay with you in the most extraordinary of ways. But indirectly, in response to your question, I know when we call the studio unknown fields, right? And it's strange. Kate got this email from. When we were setting up the Australia expedition, and she sent an email to a guy who lives out, in our senses, in the middle of nowhere in Western Australia, adjacent to a mine, and she said, we're coming through, we'd love to visit and want to talk to you. The studio's called Unknown Fields, we do this, we do that. And he said, look, these unknown fields you speak of are outside my front door, mate. That, we originally set up the studio going in search of wilderness. But there's that great quote from the Easy Rider poster, 2 men went in search of America and never found it. We're still looking, because every place we go to, we still find people living and living out fairly familiar kinds of existences that we have extraordinary capacity to adapt and end up in places that when you start to think about it, we have no real reason to be, and that's something that does stick with us. The fact that we are everywhere, and somehow we make our lives in these places.
Any other question?
Yeah. I think I have a lot of questions, but since it came up more recently in the conversation, I was wondering if you could give an example of a counter-narrative that Greenpeace felt was effective, and/or because I'm not sure if they're related or not, if you could re-articulate the section of your presentation that had to do with nature documentaries being sort of reappropriated as a data visualization, or how did you phrase it? Data narrative or
data dramatization.
Data dramatization, because I found that very compelling, and yet I didn't quite fully get it in the sort of flow of your presentation, and because I sort of see those regions between the Greenpeace aspect of my question and the second aspect of it as an example of sort of Heidegger's aphorism about the chair not touching the wall, that they're in contact, of course, but they're not engaged. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I mean the Alaska Landscape Supercomputer project was work done based around our Alaska expedition by a student of ours, Samantha Lee, and she got really caught up in the ANWR, the Arctic National Reserve, Wildlife Reserve, and she saw this extraordinary analogy between the predictive models of supercomputers in this landscape, which is caught between this amazingly charged conversation about the extraordinary species that rely on that territory to survive, and the security of US energy futures, which would, at least in some form, be ensured by the tapping of that as a resource. And what she was interested in is these systems of value that we start to apply to landscape and ecology, right? And we saw it in Australia as well. A mining group or an oil lobbyist can sit down with a decision maker and put in very clear black and white terms, a system of returns. Across a given period of time, if you unlock this resource, we can give this much back into the economy. It'll lead to these kind of gains. The conservationists have a more difficult challenge. What is the value of the loss of a certain caribou migration trail or a number of species of birds in that context? How do you measure that against a $4 billion per annum windfall from these kind of mining rights in this particular site in Australia? And the question was really, it's about valuing systems, and we don't yet have a currency with which we can talk about ecology in terms that pits it against the mining lobby. And I don't know, the project was done to think about all around the world are these landscapes caught in this space that are kind of predictive models of themselves that can end in an oil field or can end in a wildlife reserve, and how do we start to relate to them? I mean, it's a question that we, that I think we're all struggling with, right? It's an urgent question. Sorry, go on.
I have one example of a Greenpeace project that I know of, and I find it interesting not just because of what it is, but because of what is the value of the things that they're actually doing. This was in particular, it was with algae blooms on the oceans, and there was you might know, There are experiments where if you add zinc filings to salt water, and then you can sort of catalyze big plumes of algae growth quickly. And it's been known and it's been worked on, but it's never been tested in a field at the scale that would actually affect a kind of dramatic changes in the surface radiation and temperature of the planet. This is the albedo, right? The sort of absorbing the sun's rays. And there was it was a research group that suddenly found funding to basically drop, I don't remember the amount of the volume of the fillings into the ocean. But basically, it was such a large amount of stuff, and they couldn't get permission from any of these different global community countries that had rights on the territories. And then they found a small country somewhere in Central America, and essentially Greenpeace, they didn't have any, that they gave them permission, but they gave them permission to experiment to conduct an experiment in a field that would basically sort of grow out into everyone else's sort of the bordering shores. And so Greenpeace, it seemed they went and they got there, and what they ended up doing was then just sort of communicating this information. This was going to happen to a community that could listen really quickly and respond. I mean, they weren't able to do anything physically, but what they could do is suddenly circulate information at a scale that the scientists were trying to circulate this kind of, possible solution. I mean, all of it may be well-intended, but there it seemed like information was the thing it was these routes of information that was traveling that was really effective. As the weapon, not standing in front saying we're blocking you, but rather quickly alerting a kind of people that could actually trigger a set of ears that could respond. And that seems like a different kind of tactic if we're talking about first knowing what's at stake with these systems, knowing what we don't know, and then being able to circulate information that could utilize public opinion, whether it's in the Arab Springs or in public spaces, or whether it's in these ecological systems as well.
Okay, so maybe at this point we're already through 7. I would like to close this format and lead over to the more informal part at the bar where we can continue. More questions are surely to be asked. Again, thank you very much, Liam. Thank you very much, Eric. And in regards to the Institut für Raumexperimente, I would like to make the link that I missed in the beginning when I introduced you, because this is a Vorbereitungsbüro for an exhibition that that will be opened in September, bringing not only a lot of different installations and artworks, but also the Metabolic Office for the Repair of Reality, which this is kind of the experimentation phase. And Olafur Eliasson will be part of the exhibition with works, and the students, some students from the Institut für Raumexperimente are currently working on a possible intervention in the context of that exhibition. So we see that part again later in autumn, and we hope we see you again on some of the next sessions. Can we have the next slide just to make the announcement for next week? Next week we go back to German. And we have Schwindel, was von Bildern bleibt, Fotofilm Game mit Jan Dieselmeier, Wilfried Gerling, Romuald Kammaker, der letzte Woche in 100% Wirklichkeit hier zu Gast war, und Britta Neitzel. Again, 5 o'clock. And if you want to see again some of the very dense presentation Liam presented us tonight, you can go on the site. Tomorrow you have the video of this event in our archive, and you can also see the different other ones if you have missed them and it's your first time here tonight. Thank you, everyone, and see you next week.